The ordinary object. At first glance, it doesn't look like a weapon at all. It's short, lightweight, often painted in bright colors that seem almost careless. Red, orange, sometimes yellow. In a war defined by steel, firepower, and destruction, the signal flare gun feels out of place. Too simple, too loud, too obvious. You wouldn't mistake it for something meant to harm anyone. There's no menace in its shape, no intimidation in its weight. Most people would look at it and think the same thing. This is just a signaling device, something you use when you're lost, or stranded, or trying to get attention. And yet, during wartime, American soldiers carried it anyway. Not in holsters meant for combat, not with pride, but quietly, often pushed deep into a pack, or tucked away where it wouldn't get in the way. Because the flare gun wasn't there to end a fight. It was there for moments when fighting no longer mattered, moments when survival meant being seen, or heard, or simply remembered. In the chaos of war, when noise was everywhere and silence was deadly, this small, almost unimpressive object carried a strange kind of power. Not the power to take life, but the power to announce it. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything.
American soldiers didn't talk much about the flare gun. It wasn't something you compared, or showed off, or asked questions about. It was issued quietly, often with little explanation. A short briefing, a line or two in a manual. Then it disappeared into the background of everything else a soldier had to remember. Most of the time, the flare gun stayed exactly where it was placed on day one, unused. It rode along in packs through mud and snow. It sat in vehicles that never stopped moving. It stayed strapped to belts during long nights when nothing happened, and long nights when too much did. Unlike rifles or sidearms, it wasn't checked every morning. No one practiced drawing it fast. No one trained to rely on it. In fact, many soldiers hoped they would forget it was even there. Because the moment you reached for a flare gun, something had already gone wrong. You didn't pull it out because you were winning. You reached for it because you were lost, separated, cut off, or because you needed someone, anyone, to know where you were. Carrying a flare gun wasn't about readiness for combat. It was about admitting a truth no one liked to say out loud, that sometimes survival didn't mean standing your ground. Sometimes it meant being found. And in a war where movement was constant and lines shifted overnight, that small, awkward device became a quiet acknowledgement of human limits, not a plan for victory, but a plan for being noticed before it was too late.
The survival role. The true power of the flare gun was never in what it could do. It was in what it prevented. In war, panic is as dangerous as any weapon. Once it takes hold, decisions collapse. People rush. They separate. They make noise when silence is needed, or stay silent when someone should speak. The flare gun existed as a pause button, not a solution, a moment. Just knowing it was there changed how people moved through uncertainty. A soldier who knew he could signal was less likely to rush forward blindly, less likely to take risks just to avoid feeling alone, less likely to mistake fear for urgency. The flare gun didn't give orders. It didn't promise rescue. What it offered was something quieter and far more valuable. Time. Time to think. Time to wait. Time to choose restraint over desperation. In a battlefield filled with competing signals, gunfire, engines, shouting, a flare cut through everything. Not because it was subtle, but because it was unmistakable. It told anyone who saw it the same simple thing. Someone is still here. And that message carried weight far beyond its brief glow in the sky. Because in war, being acknowledged, even for a moment, could be the difference between chaos and control. The flare gun wasn't meant to dominate a situation. It was meant to stabilize it.
In the winter of 1944, movement was everything. American units advanced through unfamiliar terrain where roads disappeared overnight and landmarks meant little once snow covered them. Visibility dropped. Radio contact failed. Maps stopped matching the ground beneath their boots. This wasn't a moment for heroics. It was a moment for orientation. In conditions like these, flare guns became something close to a common language, not spoken, seen. A single flare rising into the cold sky told a story no radio could explain fast enough. It said where a unit was. It said someone was still moving. It said coordination was still possible. Convoys paused. Units slowed. Decisions were delayed, not out of fear, but because information had finally arrived. The flare didn't order anyone forward. It didn't demand action. It simply reduced uncertainty. And in wartime America's experience, reducing uncertainty often mattered more than speed. On the home front, the same principle applied. Civil defense volunteers carried flare guns during blackouts and coastal patrols, not to confront anyone, but to mark space, to signal presence, to remind others that even in darkness, someone was paying attention. In both places, the battlefield and the home front, the flare gun played the same quiet role. It didn't change the outcome through force. It changed it by preventing mistakes.
The human mind. Carrying a flare gun did something subtle to the people who had one. It didn't make them braver. It didn't make them reckless. If anything, it made them more careful. Because the flare gun represented a decision you didn't want to rush. You could carry it for months and never touch it. And many did. But knowing it was there changed how uncertainty felt. Fear became manageable. Not because danger disappeared, but because isolation did. A soldier alone in unfamiliar terrain wasn't just thinking about enemies or weather or exhaustion. He was thinking about whether he still existed to anyone else. The flare gun answered that question before it was asked. It reminded the person carrying it that disappearance wasn't inevitable, that there was still a way to reach outward, that the situation wasn't closed. Psychologically, that mattered more than comfort. It created restraint. People waited longer before acting. They observed more. They chose stillness when motion would have been easier. And perhaps most importantly, it placed responsibility back into human hands. Using a flare wasn't an instinctive reaction. It was a deliberate choice. A moment where someone had to admit this matters enough to be seen. In war, where so many actions are automatic, that pause, that moment of awareness, was rare and valuable.
The effectiveness of the flare gun had very little to do with technology. It wasn't precise, it wasn't subtle, and it certainly wasn't advanced. What made it work was meaning. A flare rising into the sky carried no ambiguity. It didn't negotiate, it didn't threaten, it didn't escalate. It simply declared presence. In American military thinking, especially during the mid-20th century, survival often depended on coordination rather than dominance. Units that stayed connected survived longer. Groups that could identify each other avoided costly mistakes, and individuals who could signal their existence reduced the risk of being forgotten. The flare gun fit perfectly into that philosophy. Its design forced intention. You couldn't use it casually. You couldn't hide it. Once fired, it committed you to visibility. That commitment mattered. It filtered out panic-driven decisions and left only deliberate ones. Culturally, Americans understood this instinctively. Self-reliance didn't mean isolation. It meant knowing when to ask for help, clearly and without apology. The flare gun embodied that idea. It wasn't a tool of force, it was a tool of acknowledgement. And in the confusion of war, being acknowledged was often the first step towards survival.
The quiet lesson. When the war ended, most flare guns disappeared quietly. They weren't displayed in museums the way rifles were. They didn't become symbols of victory. They weren't passed down with stories of bravery. Many were returned. Some were forgotten in storage. Others simply rusted away. And that feels appropriate, because the flare gun was never meant to be remembered. It existed for moments when everything else had failed, for times when strength wasn't enough, when movement wasn't possible, when silence became dangerous. The lesson it leaves behind isn't about weapons at all. It's about restraint, about recognizing the difference between action and necessity. The flare gun teaches us that survival isn't always about standing your ground or pushing forward. Sometimes survival is about admitting you need to be seen, about choosing clarity over pride, presence over force. In war, and far beyond it, the tools that matter most are often the ones we hope we never have to use. Not because they are weak, but because they remind us that staying alive is sometimes a matter of being acknowledged. And when everything else falls silent, that acknowledgement can be enough.